Okay, hi everybody. My name is Rachel, and I'm a fourth year doctoral candidate in the Department of English Language and Literature at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. So I'm really excited to be talking to you today. We had such a great time this morning. So this is it's so fun to get to do it twice. So primarily I work on 19th century British literature, and my dissertation project is on lesbian historical fiction and lesbian literature and history in general. So it really doesn't have anything to do with Bluebeard on the face of it, but I've been recently really intrigued by some of these retellings that I've been reading. And so I've just been having a lot of fun basically romancing the Gothic, going through Bluebeard and getting outside of my own research interests. So I want to say thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you to Sam and Romancing the Gothic for putting this talk together and doing all of the technological things so that I can be here. So my talk today is titled Traps, Trauma, and the Locked Door, Bluebeard in the 21st Century. So my plan for the next 43-ish minutes or so is to foreground what the Bluebeard tale is in the popular imagination and to address how it transforms in the decades leading up to the year 2000. Then I'll make some comments about the way adaptations of the Bluebeard tale have shifted in the last 2 decades to either make room for different kinds of stories within the parameters of such a dark tale, or to address new corners of the narrative that recast Bluebeard in interesting ways. The bulk of my presentation will be some close readings of Bluebeard retellings published after the year 2000 to showcase some of the different ways authors reappropriate Bluebeard for their own ends. In updating and representing this fairy tale, the adaptations I'll look at today draw together a number of discursive threads around victimhood, survival, violence, trauma, and narrative. My reading led me to ask the following research questions. How are writers thinking about and using Bluebeard in the last 2 decades? How have we moved on from the second wave feminist retellings that are by now very famous? What does victimhood and survival, as well as trauma, look like in recent Bluebeard adaptations? I hope to answer some of these questions in a preliminary way today, and I very much look forward to having a discussion with you afterwards about these questions, because as I've read many different accounts of various bloody chambers over the last several months, I've only become more intrigued. Today, I want to do 3 major things in the time we have together. So first, I'll situate the Bluebeard tale in its major cultural contexts. Then I want to illustrate that up until 2000, second wave feminism retold Bluebeard as a way of interrogating women's roles in society, albeit without an intersectional view. I'll do this through a very short discussion of Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber and Margaret Atwood's Bluebeard's Egg. Then I'll move on to an itemized discussion of the way that 21st century authors adapt the Bluebeard tale in contemporary contexts. In contemporary context. I'll first identify some of the key features of the tale that hold over from the original, such as the Gothic house and the violent antagonist. And then I'll suggest some of the ways that these retellings adapt the white, upper-class, traditionally beautiful heroine to explore new conceptions of the traumatized survivor in Bluebeard retellings. I will also argue that these adaptations focus on victimhood and survivorhood in new ways, and often gesture toward a genealogy of survival through a reanimation of Bluebeard's dead brides. So to situate you a little bit further, here are the texts I'll be working with today. So alongside Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber and Margaret Atwood's Bluebeard's Egg, I'm also dealing with Bones by Francesca Leah Block, The Glass Bottle Trick by Nalo Hopkinson, Carmen Maria Machado's memoir In the Dreamhouse, Bluebeard by Saman Chanani, with a final analysis of How to Be Eaten by Marie Edelman. These texts are not the only retellings of Bluebeard published in this period, but they are some of the most recent and will serve, I think, to illustrate the changing features of the Bluebeard plot in our cultural climate. To assume that just because you've come to this, I don't want to assume basically that you've come to this talk today knowing everything about Bluebeard or where Bluebeard comes from. So I want to unpack that before we actually get into some of the later retellings. So the first written iteration of Bluebeard that most scholars cite as the beginning of the tale's prevalence in Western literature is in Charles Perrault's collection of fairy tales published in 1697. K.C.E. Hermanson summarizes Perrault's tale as follows. In that version, Bluebeard, a wealthy nobleman with an unfortunate blue beard, courts and marries one of two sisters, who overcomes her trepidation at the beard in order, it seems, to enjoy the wealth. Bluebeard gives her the keys to all of the rooms in his extensive castle, but forbids her to use one of them, threatening her with extreme punishment should she disobey him. He leaves, and quickly she opens the forbidden chamber, discovering there the bodies of his murdered former wives. She drops the key in the blood on the floor, and because the blood is magically indelible, it betrays her guilt when Bluebeard suddenly arrives home and asks for it. He says she is to die. The wife asks for time to pray and uses it to call repeatedly to her sister to tell whether she sees their brothers coming. The brothers arrive just in time, killing Bluebeard with their swords and rescuing their sister, who, Perrault writes, quote, became mistress of all his estate. She made use of one part of it to marry her sister Anne to a young gentleman who had loved her a long while, another part to buy captain's commissions for her brothers, and the rest to marry herself to a very worthy gentleman who made her forget the ill time she had passed with Bluebeard. This is the general structure of the classic Bluebeard tale. When the Grimms rewrite it in 1812, Bluebeard looks much the same, with the final unnamed wife's death averted just in time by her brothers. The Grimms also have another tale, Fitcher's Bird, which is widely accepted to be another Bluebeard variant, wherein three sisters are married to an evil wizard, one after the other. Two are killed and placed in a vat of dismembered bodies before the third sister is able to resurrect her dead siblings and trick her husband into releasing all three of them. In this version, the wives are given an egg to protect and not a key, but the tale remains much the same otherwise. Centuries after these foundational writings and rewritings of Bluebeard, the gruesome tale of the serial wife murderer has not left our popular imagination, and it appears over and over again in explicit or implicit forms. Maria Tartar suggests that the quote Bluebeard plot is everywhere, whether we are directed to look for it or not. An unprepared heroine moves into a rambling and mysterious Gothic house filled with hidden chambers and secrets. The house and its occupants are governed by a relative stranger she has married, and her transgression provides the impetus for revelation, violence, and rescue. Therefore, we should take to heart what Tartar argues is fundamental about Bluebeard. It is, quote, not one story, but many stories, multiple scripts competing with each other for the status of the best, truest, deepest, or most authentic version. Suffice it to say, then, that the Bluebeard plot proliferates. Maria Warner writes that, quote, Bluebeard is a boogie who fascinates. His very name stirs associations with sex, virility, male readiness, and desire. The story, quote, thrills like a Hitchcock film before its time. It foreshadows thriving fantasies about serial killers and Jack the Rippers. Therefore, it's the very fascination with the tale itself, and perhaps more vividly with its themes of forbidden knowledge, secret chambers, Gothic houses, and plucky, curious heroines outwitting serial murderers that give Bluebeard its, quote, cultural edge, and result in its, quote, profound traces on our cultural memory. Writers, authors, filmmakers, and illustrators return over and over again to Bluebeard to explore themes of sexuality, domestic violence, gendered power, and trauma. With Bluebeard existing as it does in cultural memory and implicitly present across various fictions, I want to acknowledge from the outset that it really is impossible to gather and discuss every Bluebeard retelling, even from just the last 22 years. But I would posit that because we're more and more cognizant of the roles that these themes play, not just in our fiction, but in our interactions with the world at large, the way we retell Bluebeard has changed. Since the 20th century, writers have been concerned with exploring the dynamics of power as they relate to gender and sexuality, and even sometimes race, and have been using the Bluebeard plot to do so. I want to put forward, though, that many Bluebeard retellings, which I define not just as stories that deploy the Bluebeard plot, but narratives that actively reference elements of the Perrault Bluebeard, have reworked the Bluebeard narrative to ask new questions and make new space. Now, it is no longer enough to suggest that Bluebeard's last wife can live and inherit Bluebeard's fortune and live happily ever after. How does one live after such a trauma, these retellings ask? Is it possible? How do final wives survive when others have not? Many retellings also consider how the plot might be adapted to incorporate more than the beautiful, white, cisgendered, and heterosexual protagonist to reflect a more vivid and intersectional version of humanity. And in changing her, they might morph the Bluebeard plot itself. So we need not look far to find the potential for feminist intervention in relation to the Bluebeard tale. Perrault's original version has two morals. The first is that, quote, curiosity, in spite of its appeal, often leads to deep regret. To the displeasure of many a maiden, its enjoyment is short-lived. Once satisfied, it ceases to exist and always costs dearly. The second insists that, quote, no husband of our age would be so terrible as to demand the impossible of his wife, nor would he be such a jealous malcontent. In other words, curiosity, which is a distinctly feminine impulse going directly back to Eve in the garden, must be guarded against, lest you discover something you might truly not want to know, such as the fact that your husband is a serial murderer. At the same time, though, men like Bluebeard don't actually exist, and there would never truly be any need for a wife to fear her husband, or for her to disrupt the social category of heterosexual marriage to separate herself from him. These morals are, obviously, inherently patriarchal and deeply reductive. And in the 1970s and 80s, feminist authors write variants of the Bluebeard tale that criticize and adapt these two particular morals. Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber and Margaret Atwood's Bluebeard's Egg are short stories that stand in recent criticism as the pinnacle of Bluebeard retellings for their inherently feminist motivations. They focus, as many retellings do, on the final wife who will, we hope, outwit her murderous husband. Furthermore, they refute the post-lapsarian narrative of the evils of feminine curiosity by questioning, quote, those who insist that the wives were all victims of their own curiosity. Instead, quote, Bluebeard's last wife suggests that they consider the fate of the first wife. What was the first one curious about? What could she have seen? Carter's short story is set in the early 20th century. Her young protagonist has been married to a much older marquis who has recently become a widower for the second time. Taken from her mother's home in Paris to his remote and isolated castle, the protagonist quickly finds herself sexually and psychologically violated as she discovers how repulsive her new husband truly is. He inevitably leaves her with the keys, including the one which she suggests is, quote, the key to his heart. But Bluebeard corrects her, saying that it is a place where he can, quote, go sometimes on those infrequent yet inevitable occasions when the yoke of marriage seems to weigh too heavily on his shoulders. There he can go, she understands, to savor the rare pleasure of imagining himself wifeless. Carter's story proceeds much like Perrault's. The final wife opens the door and discovers the corpses. And when Bluebeard returns, she begs to say her prayers before he kills her. But instead of her brothers arriving on horseback to rescue their sister, it is her mother, who reluctantly let her leave to marry, who arrives brandishing the gun that will kill Bluebeard to save her daughter. The protagonist narrates a stunning image, quote, you never saw such a wild thing as my mother, one hand on the reins of the rearing horse while the other clasped to my father's service revolver, and behind her, the breakers of the savage indifferent sea, like the witnesses of a furious justice. The avenging mother is certainly a shift from Perrault's protagonist's brothers, taking feminine rescue out of the hands of men and placing it in the realm of maternal power and protection. Although, quote, Carter does not give us a seamless reinterpretation of Bluebeard. Instead, the way she, quote, constructs the story challenges our understanding of characters and plots that have stood the test of time. Atwood's Bluebeard variant is a far more modern meditation on gender politics and domesticity. Bluebeard's Egg follows Sally, the third and much younger wife to Ed, who Sally mistakenly reads as rather charmingly stupid and dull. Ed is a man who, in Sally's mind, cannot fathom what could have gone wrong in his previous marriages. Sally blames his unseen wives for their transgressions, setting herself and Ed apart from his failed marriages. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this tale is its lack of overt violence. Ed's wives are not dead, but dismissed, and Sally does not stumble upon a chamber of murdered wives, but rather the suggestion of an extramarital affair, which Atwood certainly frames as the killing blow to this marriage. The horror of this story is that Sally has grossly underestimated her husband, who contains hidden depths that we only see shades of. Shuli Barzali writes that, quote, in rewriting female fairy tale protagonists, Atwood primarily uses the paradigm of Bluebeard to render the complex subject position of quasi-liberated women in contemporary society. It seems that the Bluebeard structure is pared back to showcase not the Gothic excess and gore of Carter's feminist revision, but rather the circumstances under which an everyday woman might come into contact with an everyday Bluebeard. Carter calls Bluebeard's Egg, quote, a gossipy narrative about romantic betrayal and marital infidelity that is given shape by the fairy tales circulating in our culture. Tarter returns us to Bluebeard as a cultural narrative here. And overall, both of these second wave feminist retellings incur on that cultural narrative to explore women's roles within and ideally beyond heteropatriarchy. Both of these texts have received a great deal of critical attention since their publication, and they are indeed impressive and radical reinventions of the Bluebeard tale. But I think we can read them as a bit limited in their scope, or if not limited, then only at the beginnings of what might be possible in the Bluebeard cultural narrative. Both of their protagonists are white, young, and beautiful. In questioning the role of marriage in women's lives, they focus on heterosexual frameworks which they undoubtedly criticize. And they actively disidentify themselves with the wives that came before them. Sally dismisses Ed's past wives as inherently inadequate, while Carter's character leaves Bluebeard's dead wives, quote, burned or buried, and, quote, the door sealed. So I want to jump ahead now to the retellings after 2000 to explore the ways that Bluebeard variants expand and explore more intersectional frameworks and ideas of victimhood and survival. So I want to begin with Bones because it foregrounds some of the impulses that will be fully articulated later in the more recent Bluebeard variants from the last 5 years or so, including a return to the marginalized protagonist and a connection with the dead. Block's variant is set at a party in Los Angeles, and it really is truly a sex, drugs, and rock and roll version of Bluebeard, with our unnamed protagonist a part of, quote, the real bohemian scene, in which she, quote, thought she could become something else, that she could become an artist, alive, while, quote, everyone else was there for him. Our Bluebeard, Derek Blue, is a, quote, big promoter guy of enormous wealth, and it is into his house, his party, that the protagonist arrives. The short story positions, as Bluebeard variants do, its narrative around an imbalance of power. The protagonist is an aspiring artist, and Derek Blue is represented as the gate through which all successful artists must pass. The narrator recalls that he, quote, came over and smiled and took my hand and looked into my eyes and saw how hungry I was in every way. I was always hungry for food and other things. I was hungry for him, this man who seemed to have everything, and to actually be looking at me. I didn't realize why he was looking. Derek Blue, quote, knew how hungry she was and had, quote, cold beveled eyes that made the sweat on her temples evaporate, and she felt like she was high on Coke, Coke, Coke when he looked at her. Blue's magnetic pull is intoxicating, but also unnerving, and this variation is focused primarily on the power of storytelling and whose stories are told. On the night of the party, Blue, quote, told tales and reveals that he, quote, had named himself for Bluebeard because, quote, it had become a metaphor for his whole life. The narrator counters his adoration of Bluebeard by wondering why, quote, dead girls in a chamber is a fairy tale. In Blue's narrative, quote, they were a bunch of lost girls without voices or love. But to the narrator, quote, the other women's bones were talking. Although she can't see them, she, quote, knew they were there under the house, the little runaway bones of skinny, hungry girls who didn't think they were worth much, anything. So they stayed after the party was over and let Derek Blue tell them stories. Our narrator symbolically connects with the unheard stories of the victims of her contemporary Bluebeard, a serial abuser and a killer of drug-addicted women. And she herself is also one of those hungry girls who has stayed to hear Blue's stories and will, if she doesn't act fast enough, become his latest victim. The short story returns narrative power to Bluebeard's marginalized victims and literal power to the narrator. She vows to, quote, rewrite the story of Bluebeard at the end of Block's text. In the narrator's version, quote, the girl's brothers don't come to save her on horses, bearing swords, full of power, and at exactly the right moment. There are no brothers. There is no sister to call out a warning. There is only a slightly feral 100-pound girl with choppy black hair, coal-smeared eyes, torn jeans, and a pair of boots with steel toes. This girl has a little knife to slash with, a little pocket knife, and she can run. That is one thing about her. She has always been able to run. Bones does two things here. It reconnects the final wife to all of the wives who came before her, though through this kind of spiritual and drug-induced communion with the dead. But it also raises very early questions about victimhood and the kind of victims who are looked for and looked after, or who are seen as having value in this environment. Bluebeard in this text preys upon transient girls, drug-addicted girls, and girls, as the narrator says, no one will look for. But the text provides us with hope by connecting the narrator back to those victims and suggesting that she will be the one to recognize, remember, and tell their story, and also, importantly, kill Bluebeard. She, quote, could hear them singing, and they needed her to write their song. So Bones, in identifying marginalized victims as the focal point for this Bluebeard variant, and in returning narrative and physical power to a marginalized victim herself, foregrounds a lot of what we will later see in other variants. Anti-heroines, trauma survivors, reanimated or ghostly dead women who refuse to be forgotten, and the typified serial murderer whose image is available to us in countless true crime texts. All reappear in 21st century Bluebeard variants. Bloch's protagonist is not the virginal bride of Carter's variant, nor is she the housewife of Atwood's fiction. Instead, she becomes a victim we recognize, and one that challenges our perceptions of who we think of as the wife of Bluebeard. I've presented Bones to you because it showcases most of the major paradigms I'm observing in 21st century Bluebeard variants. This identification with or evocation of the dead, a focus on narrative and physical power, and a critical examination of victims and perpetrators through the archetypes of the final wife of Bluebeard. Now, I want to briefly look at four very recent variants that pull all of these ideas through in their conceptions of the Bluebeard story. The first is Nalo Hopkinson's short story, The Glass Bottle Trick. When I was researching this talk, I wanted to discover whether or not race was addressed or readdressed in contemporary Bluebeard variants. I wasn't able to find a lot, but I did find Hopkinson's short story, which intermingles the folkloric elements of Bluebeard alongside Caribbean folklore and culture. I'm aware that, especially in the early 20th century, Bluebeard has been visibly othered in illustrations, with representations often coding him as a wealthy foreign man of Turkish descent. But I wanted to explore where and how contemporary retellings focus on race in a way that was less reductive and more complicated. In The Glass Bottle Trick, race is central to the overall plot, but also to Bluebeard's pathology. In this variant, we meet Beatrice, the new wife of Samuel, a wealthy, well-traveled widower whose two previous wives have tragically died. Beatrice is pregnant and is, quote, shy to give Sammy the news. The text sets up a number of different binaries, but the most significant in this text is the division between warmth and cold. Warmth is associated with life and fertility. While Beatrice stands outside in the early part of the text, quote, sunlight was flickering through the leaves of the guava tree in the front yard. Beatrice inhaled the sweet smell of the sun-warmed fruit. The tree branches hung heavy with the pale yellow globes, smooth and round as eggs. The sun reflected off the two blue bottles suspended in the tree, sending cobalt light dancing through the leaves. The tree, like Beatrice, is heavy with expectation and similarly basking in the warmth. The glass bottles, which are crucial to the text's unfolding, are a part of Samuel's sinister control. He says to her, quote, you never heard the old people say that if someone dies, you must put a bottle in the tree to hold their spirit. Otherwise, it will come back as a duppy and haunt you. A blue bottle to keep the duppy cool so it won't come at you in hot anger for being dead. A duppy is a word used regularly in Caribbean culture to refer to a ghost or spirit, in this case, a vengeful one. Again, the warm-cold division suggests that cold is the enemy, keeping the dead in stasis, while warmth is the arena of fertility. Of course, it is Beatrice who accidentally breaks these bottles in trying to save a bird's eggs from being eaten out of a nest by a highly symbolic snake. The glass bottle trick variant is interesting for two central reasons. First, because we get an inside view into the psychological life of Bluebeard in a way that I don't think we see elsewhere. In other retellings, we know that he has a twisted conception of gender, power, and transgression. But I don't think we actually ever see his motives in very vivid detail, and I don't think that we ever also get much of an insight into his insecurities. In the glass bottle trick, this changes. We find out that, quote, Samuel didn't like Beatrice spending too much time in the sun. And, quote, Beatrice knew he just didn't want her to get brown. When the sun touched her, he could no longer pretend she was white. He loved her skin pale. In contrast to Beatrice's light skin, Samuel describes himself as, quote, black and ugly as my mother made me. But Beatrice comments that, quote, for all his love of creamy white skin, Samuel probably couldn't bring himself to approach a white woman the way he courted her. This version of Bluebeard is pathologically insecure and very tragic, and his negative associations with blackness haunt him with self-loathing, and by extension, a loathing for others. He comments that, quote, no woman should have to give birth to his ugly black babies. And Beatrice discovers that it is the pregnancies of his previous wives that has led him to kill them and imprison their bodies and souls in the house. The second reason I find the variant compelling is because even more obviously than the Block short story, we see the vengeful spirits of Bluebeard's dead wives rise up to exact their revenge. When Beatrice enters the bloody chamber, she finds, quote, two women's bodies side by side on the double bed, frozen mouths gaped open, frozen gutted bellies. The tableau is typical of the Bluebeard story, albeit with the addition of an obsession with pregnancy. Notably, however, when Beatrice opens the door, quote, a current of hot air seared past her cheek, making a plume of fog as it entered the room. The fog split in two, settled over the heads of each woman, began to take on definition. Each misty column had a face, contorted in rage. The faces were those of the bodies on the bed. One of the Deppy women leaned over her own corpse. She lapped like a cat at the blood thawing on its breast. She became a little more solid for having drunk of her own lifeblood. The other Deppy stooped to do the same. Beatrice had broken the bottles that had confined the Deppy wives, their bodies held in stasis because their spirits were trapped. She'd freed them. She'd let them into the house. Now there was nothing to cool their fury. Here in the Caribbean tradition, we see the wives of Bluebeard return to their bodies, becoming more solid and more vengeful, ready to exact their revenge on Samuel. We leave Beatrice as she goes downstairs to distract Samuel while the Deppy wives gather their strength to kill him. So in the glass bottle trick, not only has Hopkinson reappropriated the Bluebeard narrative alongside Caribbean cultural narratives, but the text identifies race as a key complication for the characters in the text, framing Bluebeard's hatred of himself and other Black bodies as the unthinkable and tragic deviance that drives the story forward. Furthermore, in recent variants in their ambition to re-articulate heteronormative structures of gender and power have begun to queer the Bluebeard story in really fascinating ways. In Carmen Maria Machado's memoir of lesbian domestic violence, In the Dreamhouse, she deploys a number of folkloric tropes as a way of connecting her story to larger cultural narratives that have traditionally been the province of heterosexual dynamics. In her chapter, Dreamhouse as Bluebeard, she frames the Bluebeard story as one of both gratuitous Gothic excess and a chilling version of an everyday narrative of domestic violence. She writes, quote, Bluebeard's greatest lie was that there was only one rule. The newest wife could do anything she wanted, anything, as long as she didn't do that single arbitrary thing, didn't stick that tiny inconsequential key into that tiny inconsequential lock. But we all know that was just the beginning, a test. She failed and lived to tell the tale, as I have. But even if she passed, even if she'd listened, there would have been some other request, a little larger, a little stranger. And if she'd kept going, there would have been a scene where Bluebeard danced around with the rotting corpses of his past wives clasped in his arms, and the newest wife would have sat there mutely, suppressing growing horror, swallowing the egg of vomit that bobbed behind her breastbone. And then later, another scene in which he did unspeakable things to the bodies, women, they'd once been women. And she just stared dead into the middle distance, seeking some mute purgatory where she could live forever. Here, Machado refutes versions of the tale where the final wife is able to conquer Bluebeard and suggests that this is not the way domestic violence works, nor is it the way serial abusers work. She also connects her own experience of lesbian domestic violence to the larger narrative of Bluebeard stories. The final wife has survived, as she has, but not without pain or trauma. There's a tension in the memoir between the, quote, sweet girl of the last wife and, quote, the sweet self of Mikado as they both suffer. Importantly, though, in the Dreamhouse identifies that although, quote, some scholars believe that Bluebeard's blue beard is a symbol of his supernatural nature, which is, quote, easier to accept than being brought to heel by a simple man, he can actually, quote, be simple, and he doesn't have to be a man. Mikado is not the only writer to queer Bluebeard in a recent variant either. In Bluebeard by Soman Chanani, Bluebeard is very much like Carter's Marquis, with the notable difference being that he adopts young boys from an orphanage in order to run through the Bluebeard plot with them instead of his traditionally female wives. Like Bones, this variant focuses on the kinds of victims usually represented in these retellings. In this version, quote, when the man with the blue beard comes, none of the boys want to go with him. And this, quote, alarms the master of the orphanage because every boy craves a home, away from the soggy beds, pestilent gruel, and ritual beatings that keep them in line. But still, Bluebeard comes, quote, hunting for something in particular. Searching for boys whom no one will miss, but also searching for an unspecified quality in a particular boy, something he doesn't find until he meets the protagonist, Pietro. According to the narrator, Pietro is unholy, with his smooth, pale limbs, tangled eyelashes, and wide, pink mouth, and two small pearls pinned through his ears, as if he isn't much of a boy at all. The others shrink as he passes, especially the older boys, afraid they'll catch whatever it is that makes him less of a man. And yet they can't stop staring, their mouths wet and cheeks blushed. Pietro is queer-coded as a boy who is not like other boys, but who also fascinates those around him. He, quote, used to put himself in the shoes of these girls who started the day ordinary and ended it in a strapping boy's arms. At the same time, though, he, quote, knows the dangers of men, and when Bluebeard takes him, he sees, quote, his chance to get out. In this variant, Bluebeard, quote, had a wife once, but wives are curious cats who are not grateful for what they have. Like Bloch's protagonist in Bones or Beatrice in The Glass Bottle Trick, Pietro feels intimately connected to similarly marginalized and forgotten victims. Quote, they are brothers, Pietro and the boys at the orphanage. Every soul that's neglected and underestimated, brothers one and all, made, quote, kin by suffering. So when Pietro is inevitably given the keys and barred against only one room, he realizes, quote, the game has begun. When he opens the door of the bloody chamber and finds 6 corpses of all the boys who came before him, he overcomes his horror and vows that, quote, the story is not over yet, even though it's been told before, each boy thinking they're different. But Pietro is different. He returns to the chamber and bends, quote, down to the first corpse and gazes into scared eyes while, quote, touching his cold, dark skin as if Pietro is there with him at death's stroke, holding him through the fear. Pietro kisses him on the forehead, a kiss to bond them in brotherhood and love, and in return he hears the boy's story in his heart. Pietro's queer communion with the dead boys constitutes an identification with their status as marginalized victims of a tyrant. He removes their bodies from the chamber, something that's rarely done in Bluebeard variants, and rearranges them in the dining room. Through the spiritual communion, he reclaims their identities. He writes their names and attributes on their chests, quote, Alistair, who loves cats, Rowan, who loves chocolate, etc. The tableau so distracts Bluebeard, who has effectively stumbled upon a bloody chamber in his own way, that Pietro is able to spring his trap and kill him. This variant therefore presents us with a queer survivor whose ability to outwit Bluebeard is couched in his devotion to his spiritual brothers, whose identities he reclaims by returning their names to them and removing them from Bluebeard's chamber. So far, we've considered the different ways 21st century authors reframe Bluebeard as a way of thinking through and beyond the original elements of the plot. Their variants are primarily focused on exploring ideologies of victimhood, power dynamics, and questioning what Bluebeard can reveal to us about whose stories get told and how. I think that these retellings are fixated on marginalization and trauma, and on ways of overcoming the oppression that Bluebeard both performs as a murderer and represents as a person with all the social, financial, and gendered power. Now we arrive at the text that generated my interest in this topic, Maria Edelman's How to Be Eaten. How to Be Eaten is the most recent Bluebeard variant that we'll be looking at today, and I think it's appropriate to end with this one because it draws together in very explicit terms a lot of the themes and issues that keep cropping up in Bluebeard variants from the last several years. The novel draws together 5 very different and equally traumatized characters, 4 from well-known fairy tale adaptations, so Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel, Bluebeard, and Rumpelstiltskin, and 1 from a Bachelor-like reality show that plays, I think, on the idea of what we might think of as a fairy tale romance. The women are each a part of a weekly trauma support group that encourages the women to share their stories with one another and talk about them. Overwhelmed by, quote, recurring nightmares, intrusive thoughts, numbness, self-destructive behavior, anger, sadness, guilt, shame. The women are all very modern versions of themselves, and by placing them in this very contemporary setting of group trauma therapy, the novel makes explicit comments about how we can consider these tropes or stories in light of things like the Me Too movement and this surge of interest in true crime in the last 5 years. These stories are reframed under the lens of serial killing and true crime, for example. Red Riding Hood and Gretel, who I won't be dealing with today, are both infamous for their involvement as children in some of the most notorious and unexplained true crime cases. Bernice, the last girlfriend of Bluebeard, is also famous for escaping a serial killer, and she's widely recognized because of her presence on 24-hour news cycles as, quote, Bluebeard's girlfriend. So true crime and trauma are major considerations in this novel, plus the fact that the trauma support group they've been invited to join is actually being secretly filmed with the idea that their meetings will later become a television show broadcast as the unfiltered narratives of some of society's most famous victims. So that adds another layer of commodification, glorification of violence, and the way that these women's stories are used against them. I just want to focus quickly on the part of the novel that deals with Bernice and Bluebeard to hopefully draw together a lot of the different themes that we've discussed today, and to point out that once again, there's a lot of concern around victimhood, survival, storytelling, and a critical focus on who gets to tell their story and when. Although the Bluebeard story develops on much the same lines as the other retellings we've looked at today, Bernice, like many of our contemporary narrators, is different from the traditional fairy tale heroine. She's fat. And, quote, in freeze-frame footage from CNN, she had a double chin, a slight smirk, a nefarious brown eye peeking out from under a bright umbrella. Yet in the group, in real life, quietly eating a cookie, sans CNN, she appears less suspicious, less homely, less fat. But still, her fatness works against her in the public eye, because as Bachelor winner Ashley says, quote, I guess I heard you were in on it, like helping him for money. I wasn't really paying attention, but Bluebeard's exes were all kind of, she brings her hands narrowly together and draws them down, more like models, whereas Bernice is, quote, more like a sidekick type than a girlfriend type. It's interesting that even while acknowledging that serial murderer Bluebeard is responsible for the deaths of multiple women, Bernice is evaluated based on his imagined capacity to desire her. The crime of Bernice's fatness, which makes it unthinkable that this man might sexually victimize her, must be reinterpreted to cast Bernice as an accomplice. But as Bernice reminds us, quote, fat people can have boyfriends, and, quote, whatever you heard, maybe it's not the whole story. Bluebeard is a tech billionaire in this variant who pursues Bernice precisely because he can observe her insecurities and exploits them. His, quote, hipstery blue beard sets him apart, as usual, and although he makes his fortune in the digital world, he is obsessed with arcane objects and antiques. He shows Bernice, quote, a simple lamp with an asymmetrical leather shade, and a, quote, trio of bespoke leather journals. Later, Bernice will discover that these and other objects have been made with the skin and other body parts of his various victims, and he delights in parading them around. Over the course of their relationship, Bluebeard gives her the access codes to every room in the house and asks her not to go in only one. Inevitably, she does and finds the desiccated corpses of his previous girlfriends, some of whom she recognizes. Bernice narrowly escapes the house, and Bluebeard commits suicide before the police can apprehend him. Interestingly, this novel doesn't seem to be that concerned with the formal features of the Bluebeard narrative. They happen. Bluebeard is identified as a serial killer and one with some very troubling obsessions with his victims' bodies. But really, what the novel is about is exploring how one individual can function in spite of the enormous trauma of this kind of experience, and how one copes with the survivor's guilt in relation to the numerous other wives or girlfriends who have not survived a similar encounter. Bernice alternately feels isolated, stupid, full of shame, guilty, and unworthy. The novel refuses to abandon Bernice on the front steps of Bluebeard's Gothic castle, and instead follows her into the shreds of her normal life. Quote, "The news stories don't make any sense," says Bernice. "They imply I'm not attractive enough to have been dating him, so I must have been helping him. But how? Luring women, cover-ups? You know, when people recognize me, they cross the street. They think I helped him, and they're not even afraid. They're just disgusted. I'm nothing without him, not even a threat." Bernice is then lost in a vortex of trauma and misrepresentation. But when the other women in group encourage her to do interviews, she responds that, quote, "It didn't seem right because, quote, the dead women can't set the record straight. They don't get a say." Overwhelmed with survivor's guilt, Bernice wonders, quote, "Why should I get to sit down and tell my story? Why should I get an audience?" In her dreams, quote, Bluebeard's exes were a legion of the undead, crawling out from under mansion floorboards and beds. Bernice, the final wife of Bluebeard, is lost and trapped in her own guilt and isolation. She says, quote, "I wanted to be alone forever, and I never wanted to be alone again. I wanted to never unlock another door and never enter another unfamiliar room. I didn't want to encounter any more mysteries. I wanted to avoid everything, myself, the news, the color blue, every shade. I wanted blue eradicated. I knew I should be grateful for sky, for the sun, for days at all, but I wanted to escape, just shoot out of the atmosphere into the blackness of outer space, or else I wanted to fold into myself like origami, so that I could see only the darkness of my own inner edges. But even then, I knew the dead women from my dreams would be waiting, stretching their bony, decaying hands out to me, begging me to give them faces, to give them names." This is not the triumphant story of the final wife outsmarting Bluebeard. This is a narrative of guilt and trauma. Once again, we have an evocation and identification with the previous victims, one that will bear out later in the text when Bernice retrieves the furniture and objects made from their bodies and begins to conduct conversations with them. Here, this connection with the dead seems less like an overpowering impetus to survival and more like a haunting on several levels. Bernice is haunted by ghosts, her own image in the media, and her guilt. Eventually, Bernice will only be able to recover herself by saying goodbye to the objects she takes from the house. But the novel never allows us to forget that Bernice is continually struggling to find a way to live beyond the bloody chamber. So I realize that I've taken you through a veritable rabbit warren of Bluebeard retellings, many of which have very similar structures, and I know that it's difficult to tell them apart. So to conclude, I just want to return very quickly to my initial research questions. First, how are writers thinking about and using Bluebeard in the last 2 decades? These retellings show us that authors are expanding Bluebeard as a cultural narrative to explore narratives of marginalization and victimization, especially as they relate to queerness and race or other marginal subject positions. Most of our texts show us this through their various and sometimes unlikely protagonists. Second, how have we moved on from the second wave feminist retellings that are by now very famous? Again, these texts are interrogating how white, heteronormative folkloric frameworks, even in Bluebeard, are far too limited in their scope. Third, what does victimhood and survival, as well as trauma, look like in recent Bluebeard adaptations? Overall, I think it looks very messy. The trauma and violence of the Bluebeard plot cannot end with Bluebeard's death. For the wife who survives, and often for the restless corpses of the wives who did not, their trauma narratives are just beginning. Thank you very, very much. Feel free to email me, tweet me. More Bluebeard talk after today is always welcome. And here are a few of my sources, which I'll show you quickly, but I can always share these later. So thank you all very much for listening.